The most dangerous assumptions are the ones people make before a single word is spoken. On most Friday evenings, downtown Atlanta moved with the comfortable rhythm of people finally leaving work behind. Office buildings slowly emptied, traffic rolled beneath glowing streetlights, and restaurants filled with families, co-workers, and friends eager to enjoy the beginning of the weekend. For Vanessa Carter and Victoria Carter, however, Friday nights rarely belonged to them. Weeks of demanding assignments, endless reports, and unpredictable schedules had made uninterrupted personal time feel like a luxury instead of a routine. That evening was supposed to be different. The twin sisters had promised each other that work would remain at the office. No discussions about investigations. No conversations about pending cases. No checking government phones every few minutes. Just dinner, quiet conversation, and a chance to remember what life felt like outside the responsibilities they carried every day. As they stepped onto the sidewalk leading toward one of their favorite neighborhood restaurants, neither sister attracted much attention. Vanessa wore a tailored dark business suit beneath a lightweight coat, while Victoria dressed with the same understated professionalism that blended naturally into Atlanta's busy evening crowd. They looked like two successful professionals finishing another ordinary workweek. Nobody passing by could have guessed that both women served as special agents with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They had learned long ago that true authority rarely announced itself. It quietly walked through the world without demanding recognition. The warm light pouring through the restaurant windows immediately welcomed them inside. Soft blues music drifted through the dining room. Conversations mixed with the sound of silverware against ceramic plates, and the rich aroma of Southern cooking filled the air. A smiling hostess greeted the sisters before leading them toward a comfortable booth near the front windows. Vanessa glanced around with quiet appreciation. Couples laughed together over shared desserts. An elderly veteran carefully folded his newspaper beside a cup of coffee, and a young family celebrated what appeared to be a birthday. It looked like the kind of evening people remembered for all the right reasons. Victoria smiled as she placed her phone face down on the table. "No interruptions tonight," she said. Vanessa returned the smile. "That sounds like the best plan we have made all week." They opened their menus without any urgency, joking about how neither of them had cooked a proper meal in days. The conversation drifted toward childhood memories, family recipes, and vacations they kept promising themselves they would finally take someday. For a few precious minutes, they were not federal agents responsible for difficult decisions. They were simply sisters enjoying the comfort of familiar company after another demanding week. Their drinks arrived first, followed by fresh bread, placed carefully at the center of the table. Vanessa thanked the server warmly before looking toward the large front windows where downtown Atlanta continued moving at its usual pace. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing suggested that within the next few minutes, an ordinary dinner would become something every person inside the restaurant would remember long after the tables had been cleared. Somewhere beyond the glass, two white police officers had just finished responding to an unrelated call nearby. As they walked past the restaurant entrance, their attention shifted toward the dining room. They noticed two black twin sisters seated quietly together, speaking softly over dinner. Sometimes history changes because of extraordinary events. Sometimes it changes because someone chooses to believe an assumption before discovering the truth. Neither Vanessa nor Victoria realized that their peaceful evening had just become the beginning of a lesson that everyone inside the restaurant was about to witness. Vanessa reached for a piece of warm bread, while Victoria laughed about a family recipe their grandmother used to make every Sunday afternoon. It was the kind of conversation that reminded them life could still feel wonderfully ordinary despite the careers they had chosen. The server returned with 2 glasses of iced tea, smiled politely, and promised that dinner would be ready in just a few minutes. Around them, the restaurant continued with its comfortable rhythm. A retired couple quietly shared a slice of pie near the windows. Several college students celebrated the end of final exams. A businessman finished answering emails before placing his phone inside his jacket pocket. Every table carried its own story, none of them expecting to become part of someone else's. Outside, officers Ethan Walker and Kyle Bennett slowed their pace as they looked through the front windows. Their patrol shift had been uneventful, and they had just completed paperwork connected to an unrelated call a few blocks away. Ethan noticed the twin sisters almost immediately. He frowned slightly before saying something to his partner that caused both officers to stop walking. From the sidewalk, they observed the sisters for several moments without speaking to anyone inside. Instead of seeing two professionals enjoying a quiet dinner, they allowed quick assumptions to fill the gaps where facts should have been. Kyle glanced toward the parking area before looking back through the glass. Neither officer had witnessed suspicious behavior. No restaurant employee had requested assistance. No customer appeared distressed. Yet the confidence with which the sisters carried themselves seemed to attract attention they had never intended to invite. Inside the restaurant, Vanessa noticed movement near the entrance but paid little attention. She had spent enough years working in law enforcement to recognize that patrol officers regularly entered businesses during evening shifts. She simply expected them to continue on their way. Victoria unfolded her napkin and smiled. I almost forgot what it feels like to finish an entire conversation without someone calling about work. Vanessa nodded. Let us enjoy every minute while we still can. Their meals arrived, filling the table with the comforting aroma of grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, and freshly prepared rice. Before either sister could take the first bite, the front door opened again. The conversations throughout the restaurant softened almost imperceptibly as the two officers stepped inside with measured confidence. Their uniforms drew brief glances from nearby diners before everyone attempted to return to their meals. Instead of approaching the counter or greeting the manager, Ethan walked directly toward the sisters' table with Kyle only a step behind. Vanessa calmly looked up from her plate, meeting the approaching officers with the same respectful expression she offered anyone who addressed her. Victoria remained seated, her posture relaxed but attentive. The officers stopped beside the table. Ethan spoke first in a firm but controlled voice. Good evening, ladies. We would like to ask you a few questions. Several nearby conversations faded completely as curious eyes shifted toward the unexpected interaction. The restaurant manager looked up from behind the register, uncertain why the officers had approached customers who had been quietly enjoying dinner. Vanessa offered a polite smile that revealed neither concern nor irritation. Years of experience had taught her that remaining calm often revealed more than speaking quickly ever could. She gently placed her fork on the edge of the plate and looked directly at the officers. Good evening, officers, she said evenly. How may we help you? At that moment, nobody inside the restaurant realized that the next few minutes would expose the difference between suspicion built on assumptions and judgment grounded in facts. Officer Ethan Walker maintained steady eye contact with Vanessa while his partner quietly observed both sisters without saying a word. We received information that requires us to verify a few things, Ethan said in a measured voice. Vanessa listened patiently before replying with the same calm professionalism that had carried her through countless difficult conversations during her career. Certainly, officer. May I ask what information you are referring to? Ethan hesitated for only a brief moment. We are conducting a follow-up regarding suspicious activity reported in this area. Victoria glanced around the dining room without moving from her seat. The peaceful atmosphere that had filled the restaurant only minutes earlier had quietly shifted. Nearby conversations had almost disappeared. Diners pretended to continue eating while discreetly watching the exchange from the corners of their eyes. The restaurant manager stood behind the host station with an uncertain expression, trying to determine whether anyone needed assistance. Vanessa nodded respectfully. We understand that you have a job to do. Her composed response seemed almost unexpected. There was no anger in her voice, no sarcasm, no attempt to embarrass the officers, only quiet professionalism. Ethan continued, May we see identification? Vanessa exchanged a brief glance with Victoria before answering. May I ask whether everyone inside the restaurant is being asked for identification this evening? The question was polite, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. Ethan answered carefully. We are speaking with you at this time. Victoria rested both hands calmly on the edge of the table. May we know what specifically caused your concern? Once again, the question remained respectful, yet left very little room for vague explanations. Kyle shifted his weight slightly before speaking for the first time. We are simply following up on information available to us. Vanessa looked toward the large front window, where evening traffic continued flowing through downtown Atlanta, as though nothing unusual was happening. She had spent years interviewing witnesses and evaluating facts. Experience had taught her that facts created confidence, while assumptions often created uncertainty. The distinction mattered. Around them, several customers exchanged quiet glances. An elderly Army veteran seated near the window lowered his coffee cup and watched silently. A young couple paused in the middle of their conversation. Even the servers moved more carefully through the dining room, sensing the tension without hearing every word. Victoria offered a small, reassuring smile toward the nearby server, hoping to communicate that everything remained under control. The young woman nodded appreciatively before stepping back toward the kitchen. Ethan looked once more at the sisters. Their confidence seemed unusual to him, not because they appeared confrontational, but because they appeared remarkably composed. Neither woman displayed nervousness. Neither hurried to explain themselves. Neither reacted with hostility. They simply answered every question thoughtfully and expected the same professionalism in return. Vanessa folded her hands together on the table. "Officer, we respect the work that law enforcement performs every day. We also believe every interaction should be guided by clear facts." Ethan studied her expression, searching for something that would confirm the assumptions he had already formed, but he found only patience and quiet confidence. The silence between them grew heavier than any raised voice could have been. Every person watching sensed that something important was unfolding, although no one yet understood exactly what it was. Victoria finally looked directly at Ethan and spoke with calm clarity. "Before we continue, there is one important question we would appreciate having answered." The entire restaurant seemed to pause, waiting to hear what she would say next. Victoria looked directly at Officer Ethan Walker, her voice remaining calm enough that the people closest to the table had to lean in slightly to hear her. "Officer, are we being detained, or are we free to continue our dinner?" The question settled over the restaurant with surprising weight. It was not spoken with defiance. It carried no frustration or accusation. It was simply clear, respectful, and direct. Ethan paused before answering. For the first time since entering the restaurant, his confidence seemed interrupted by the realization that every step he took from this point forward required careful consideration. Kyle glanced briefly toward his partner, waiting for him to respond. Several nearby diners exchanged quiet looks, sensing that the conversation had shifted away from ordinary questioning and toward something much more significant. Vanessa remained completely composed, her hands resting comfortably on the edge of the table. She had watched enough professional interviews throughout her career to recognize moments when silence often revealed more than additional words. The restaurant manager quietly approached within a respectful distance. "Officers," he said politely, "is everything all right? These ladies have been here since they arrived. They have been courteous to everyone." Ethan acknowledged the manager with a brief nod before returning his attention to the sisters. "We are conducting an inquiry," he replied. The manager accepted the response, but remained nearby, not because he wished to interfere, but because he cared about every customer inside his restaurant. Across the dining room, the retired Army veteran who had been enjoying his evening coffee continued watching with thoughtful eyes. Years of military service had taught him that professionalism could often be measured by how people handled ordinary moments rather than extraordinary ones. He quietly folded his newspaper and placed it beside his plate without saying a word. Vanessa spoke again, her tone measured and respectful. "We appreciate the work law enforcement performs every day. We simply want to understand the legal basis for interrupting our meal." Ethan answered carefully. "We received information that caused concern." Vanessa nodded slightly. "Has anyone identified us as being involved in unlawful activity?" Another brief silence followed. Kyle looked around the restaurant as though searching for additional confirmation, Yet every customer he saw appeared focused on nothing more than an ordinary Friday evening. The server who had delivered the sisters' meals stood near the kitchen entrance, uncertain whether to clear the cooling plates or wait until the conversation concluded. The aroma of freshly prepared food still drifted gently through the dining room, creating a striking contrast with the growing tension surrounding a single table. Victoria offered a reassuring smile toward the nervous server before returning her attention to the officers. "We understand your responsibilities," she said. "We also believe every citizen deserves to know why they are being questioned." Ethan slowly inhaled, recognizing that each answer he offered was now being quietly observed by dozens of witnesses. Security cameras mounted near the entrance and above the dining room continued recording every second without emotion or opinion. They simply preserved facts. Vanessa glanced briefly toward the cameras before looking back at Ethan. "Officer," she said with quiet confidence, "if there is a lawful reason for this conversation, we are prepared to cooperate fully. If not, we would appreciate the opportunity to enjoy the dinner we came here to share." Ethan studied both sisters once more. Their composure never changed. Their confidence never wavered. Instead of finding the uncertainty he expected, he found two remarkably disciplined professionals who seemed entirely comfortable allowing patience, courtesy, and the truth to guide whatever happened next. Edit. The quiet stillness inside the restaurant seemed to stretch for several long seconds. Officer Ethan Walker looked from Vanessa to Victoria as though expecting one of them to become impatient, but neither sister moved. Their dinner remained untouched. Their expressions remained composed, and their attention never drifted from the conversation taking place in front of them. Vanessa finally offered a courteous smile. "Officer, we believe in cooperation. We also believe clarity benefits everyone involved." Ethan gave a slight nod, uncertain where the conversation was leading. Vanessa slowly reached into the inside pocket of her tailored jacket with calm, deliberate movements that left no room for misunderstanding. Victoria mirrored the same careful professionalism, retrieving a slim leather credential wallet from her own jacket. Neither woman rushed. Neither attempted to create drama. They simply placed the closed credential holders gently on the table between themselves and the officers. "Before we continue," Vanessa said evenly, "we believe it is appropriate for you to know exactly who you are speaking with." Ethan glanced down at the leather cases, then back toward the sisters. Kyle leaned forward slightly, curiosity replacing the confidence that had accompanied him into the restaurant only minutes earlier. Vanessa opened her credential wallet first. The gold badge caught the warm overhead lighting, while her official identification remained clearly visible beside it. Victoria calmly opened hers as well, revealing an identical style of federal credentials. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Ethan stared at the identification, reading it once before instinctively reading it again. His expression changed almost imperceptibly as certainty gave way to disbelief. Kyle's eyes widened as he looked from one credential to the other, silently confirming that he had not misunderstood what was in front of him. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Both women, both special agents, twin sisters. The restaurant remained completely silent. Nearby diners could not read every detail from where they sat, but they immediately recognized that something unexpected had happened. The retired Army veteran near the window slowly removed his reading glasses and folded them carefully onto the table. The restaurant manager stood motionless beside the host station, watching the officer's expressions transform before a single explanation had been offered. Vanessa allowed several respectful seconds to pass before speaking again. "We did not intend for our professions to become part of tonight's dinner. We came here to enjoy a quiet evening as sisters. Victoria nodded gently. Our careers do not place us above anyone else. They simply remind us how important it is for every encounter to be guided by facts instead of assumptions." Ethan carefully examined the credentials once more before returning them with noticeably greater respect than before. "Special agents," he said quietly. "I was not aware." Vanessa accepted the credential wallet without changing her calm expression. That much is clear, officer. Her words contained no sarcasm, only quiet honesty. Kyle lowered his eyes briefly before looking back toward the sisters. The confidence that had defined his earlier questions had been replaced by thoughtful reflection. Around the dining room, conversations remained suspended as customers sensed the emotional shift unfolding before them. No one applauded. No one celebrated. There was only silence, the kind that often follows the sudden arrival of undeniable truth. Outside, patrol lights reflected softly across the restaurant windows, while inside, every security camera continued recording the interaction exactly as it had unfolded. From the beginning, Vanessa closed her credential wallet and rested it beside her dinner plate. Now that everyone understands who we are, she said with steady composure, perhaps we can all focus on the more important question. What facts led to this conversation in the first place? Officer Ethan Walker remained silent for a long moment after hearing Vanessa's question. The confidence that had guided his decisions only minutes earlier had been replaced by careful reflection. He looked briefly toward Officer Kyle Bennett before answering. Special Agent Carter, the information we received was limited, and we believe it required follow-up. Vanessa acknowledged the statement with a slight nod. Following up on information is an important responsibility, she replied evenly. The responsibility becomes even more important when deciding how that information is applied. Victoria folded her hands together on the table, her voice carrying the same calm professionalism. Facts deserve to arrive before conclusions. That protects everyone, including the officers making difficult decisions. The words settled quietly over the dining room. They were not spoken as criticism. They sounded more like a lesson learned through years of experience. Ethan understood that immediately. Before he could respond, the restaurant manager stepped forward respectfully. Officers, if it helps clarify anything, these ladies arrived about 20 minutes ago. They greeted our staff, waited patiently for their table, and have been nothing but courteous since they walked through the front door. Ethan thanked him sincerely. I appreciate the information. The retired Army veteran near the window slowly stood from his table, carrying his coffee cup with him before stopping several feet away. Officer, he said politely, I have been sitting here since before these ladies arrived. Everything the manager said is accurate. I did not observe any disruptive behavior. Ethan listened carefully. Thank you, sir. The veteran nodded once. In my years of service, I learned that witnesses matter because they help replace assumptions with facts. His quiet observation seemed to resonate throughout the room. Several customers nodded subtly without saying anything. Vanessa glanced toward the security cameras mounted near the ceiling. Fortunately, she said, restaurants like this often preserve an objective record of events. The manager immediately responded. Yes, ma'am. The cameras cover the entrance, the dining room, and the front counter. The recordings are securely stored. Victoria Smail de Priscetibli. That protects your staff, your customers, and anyone responding to a situation. Ethan followed her gaze toward the cameras. For the first time that evening, he considered the interaction from beginning to end exactly as it would appear on video, free from emotion, assumption, or memory. Kyle quietly lowered his notebook without writing another word. Vanessa continued speaking in the same measured tone. Professional accountability should never be feared. It exists because every person deserves fairness, and every officer deserves decisions supported by reliable facts. Ethan slowly nodded. Understand. There was genuine sincerity in his voice now. He reached for his radio and requested that Sergeant Michael Hayes respond to the restaurant so the interaction could be properly documented according to department procedures. His request was calm, routine, and professional. No emergency language was used. No urgency was implied. Only a commitment to ensuring that the situation was handled transparently. Within moments, dispatch acknowledged the request. The restaurant remained peaceful as conversations gradually returned in quiet voices. The tension that filled the room earlier had begun to transform into thoughtful reflection. Vanessa looked at her untouched dinner before smiling faintly at Victoria. It appears our meal has become colder than we planned. Victoria smiled back. Fortunately, Patience usually ages better than assumptions. Several nearby customers quietly smiled after hearing the remark. Even Ethan allowed himself a respectful nod of understanding. Outside, the glow of approaching headlights reflected softly across the restaurant windows as Sergeant Michael Hayes arrived, unaware that he was about to step into a conversation that had already become far more meaningful than an ordinary Friday evening call. Sergeant Michael Hayes entered the restaurant with the steady confidence of someone who had responded to hundreds of routine calls throughout his career. He greeted the manager with a polite nod before walking toward the table where officers Ethan Walker and Kyle Bennett were waiting beside Vanessa and Victoria Carter. The atmosphere was noticeably calmer than dispatch had suggested. Nobody appeared frightened. Nobody was arguing. The only thing filling the room was an unusual silence, as though every person present understood they were witnessing something important. Ethan immediately briefed the sergeant in a measured voice, carefully explaining each step that had led to the encounter. He made no attempt to exaggerate or defend his earlier decisions. Instead, he simply described the sequence of events as accurately as he could. Sergeant Hayes listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, the sergeant turned respectfully toward Vanessa and Victoria. "Good evening, ladies. I am Sergeant Michael Hayes. Thank you for remaining patient while we review everything properly." Vanessa offered a courteous smile. "Thank you for coming, Sergeant. We appreciate professionalism." Victoria nodded in agreement. "Our hope is simply that the facts speak for themselves." Hayes acknowledged both women before briefly examining the federal credentials they had already presented. He returned them immediately with visible respect. "Thank you, special agents. I understand." The restaurant manager quietly approached with a tablet containing access to the restaurant security system. "Sergeant, if you would like, we can review the camera recordings." Hayes accepted the offer without hesitation. "That will be helpful." Within moments, the manager displayed footage from the dining room cameras. The recording showed Vanessa and Victoria entering the restaurant, greeting the hostess warmly, thanking the server, speaking quietly with each other, and patiently waiting for their meals. Nothing in the video suggested disruptive behavior. Nothing supported the assumptions that had prompted additional attention. The retired Army veteran remained nearby, observing silently until Sergeant Hayes finished reviewing the footage. "Sergeant," he said respectfully, "my statement matches what those cameras show. These ladies conducted themselves with dignity from the moment they arrived." Hayes thanked him sincerely before making a brief note. He then looked toward Ethan and Kyle. "Professional judgment depends on observable facts. The recordings and witness statements provide valuable context that must be included in our documentation." Neither officer argued. Ethan quietly nodded. Kyle accepted the observation with thoughtful humility. Vanessa watched the exchange without satisfaction or resentment. Years in federal service had taught her that accountability was never about embarrassing another professional. It was about protecting public trust. She spoke gently. "Every officer will eventually face a difficult decision. What matters most is the willingness to evaluate that decision honestly afterward." Hayes looked at her with genuine appreciation. That perspective serves every agency well. As the review concluded, dispatch notified Sergeant Hayes that Captain Robert Sullivan had been informed because the encounter involved federal personnel. Hayes acknowledged the update calmly before placing his radio back on his shoulder. The information surprised several customers, but neither Vanessa nor Victoria reacted. To them, additional oversight was simply another part of ensuring transparency. The restaurant slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Servers resumed delivering meals. Families continued quiet conversations. The earlier tension had evolved into reflection rather than discomfort. Ethan stood silently for a moment before looking toward Vanessa. "Special Agent Carter, I recognize that this evening did not unfold the way any of us expected." Vanessa met his eyes with the same composed expression she had maintained from the beginning. "Neither did we, officer. That is precisely why every interaction deserves patience before judgment." Just then, headlights illuminated the restaurant windows once again as another vehicle pulled into the parking lot, signaling that the evening's most important conversation about responsibility and leadership was only beginning. Captain Robert Sullivan entered the restaurant with calm, deliberate steps, acknowledging Sergeant Michael Hayes before quietly taking in the scene around him. He noticed the untouched meals, the attentive customers, the restaurant manager standing nearby, and the two sisters who remained remarkably composed despite the unexpected interruption to their evening. Nothing about the atmosphere suggested hostility. Instead, it reflected something far more meaningful. It reflected people waiting to see whether professionalism would guide the final outcome. Sergeant Hayes summarized the situation with careful accuracy, including the witness statements, the restaurant security footage, and the sequence of events already documented. Captain Sullivan listened without interruption before turning toward Vanessa and Victoria. Special Agents Carter, thank you for your patience this evening. Vanessa answered with the same calm courtesy she had shown from the beginning. Thank you, Captain. We understand that responsible leadership begins with listening before reaching conclusions. Sullivan nodded thoughtfully. That is a principle every officer should remember. Almost as if the evening had one final lesson prepared, another vehicle quietly arrived outside the restaurant. A few moments later, Special Agent in Charge David Morgan stepped through the entrance after receiving notification that two members of his field office had been involved in a public interaction with local law enforcement. He greeted Captain Sullivan with a professional handshake before looking toward Vanessa and Victoria. I trust both of you are all right. Victoria smiled reassuringly. We are perfectly fine, sir. Everyone has remained professional. Morgan glanced briefly around the dining room, recognizing the importance of the setting. Good, he replied, because professionalism should always leave more room for understanding than for division. Captain Sullivan agreed. The available evidence is consistent. The restaurant video, witness statements, and the timeline all support the same. Conclusion. Ethan Walker stood quietly beside Kyle Bennett, listening carefully as the discussion unfolded. The confidence with which he had entered the restaurant had long disappeared. In its place stood a deeper appreciation for how quickly assumptions could shape decisions before all the facts had been gathered. Captain Sullivan turned toward both officers. Every badge represents public trust. That trust grows stronger when we are willing to examine our own decisions honestly. Ethan nodded respectfully. Yes, Captain. Kyle quietly echoed the same acknowledgement. David Morgan then addressed everyone in the room, speaking in a calm voice that carried easily without becoming loud. Federal agencies and local departments succeed when they respect one another and when every individual is treated with dignity. Tonight should remind all of us that appearances never replace evidence. Several customers quietly nodded. Even those who had never worked in public service understood the truth behind those words. The retired Army veteran smiled faintly before lifting his coffee cup in quiet appreciation. The restaurant manager looked relieved that the evening was ending with thoughtful conversation instead of conflict. Vanessa looked toward Ethan and Kyle with genuine sincerity. None of us can change the first impression that forms in another person's mind. What we can control is whether we allow facts to replace that impression once they become available. Victoria added gently, justice is strongest when it protects every person equally, including those who make mistakes and choose to learn from them. The dining room remained silent for a moment as those words settled naturally into every corner of the restaurant. Captain Sullivan thanked the manager for preserving the security footage, thanked the witnesses for their cooperation, and confirmed that the interaction would be documented according to department policy. As the formal conversation concluded, the atmosphere finally began to resemble the peaceful Friday evening it had been before assumptions had interrupted an ordinary dinner, leaving behind not resentment, but a quiet reminder that the strongest authority is always guided by fairness, humility, and the willingness to seek the truth. Captain Robert Sullivan and Special Agent in Charge David Morgan exchanged one final professional handshake before quietly stepping away from the sisters' table. Their conversation with Sergeant Michael Hayes continued briefly near the entrance, focusing on documentation, witness statements, and preserving the restaurant security recordings according to established procedures. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, and no celebration. The evening had become something far more meaningful than proving who was right or wrong. It had become a reminder that public trust depended on the willingness to place truth above assumption. Officer Ethan Walker took a slow breath before returning to Vanessa and Victoria. His expression reflected honest reflection rather than embarrassment. "Special Agents Carter," he said sincerely, "I would like to apologize for interrupting your evening and for the assumptions that influenced my judgment before all the facts were available." Kyle Bennett nodded beside him. "I share that apology. We should have allowed the evidence to guide our decisions from the beginning." Vanessa looked at both officers with the same calm dignity she had demonstrated throughout the entire evening. "Thank you for saying that. Accountability is never about perfection. It is about recognizing opportunities to do better the next time." Victoria smiled gently. "Every profession carries responsibility. What matters is whether we continue learning after difficult moments." Ethan accepted those words with genuine appreciation. "I will remember this evening for a long time." The retired Army veteran quietly finished the last sip of his coffee before walking toward the sisters' table. "Ladies," he said warmly, "I served this country for many years. Tonight reminded me that character often speaks more clearly than rank or title. Thank you for handling everything with such grace." Vanessa stood and shook his hand respectfully. "Thank you for your service, sir, and thank you for speaking when your observations could help establish the facts." The restaurant manager approached with an apologetic smile. "Your dinners have been prepared again, so they are fresh and warm. Please allow us to take care of everything this evening." Victoria smiled appreciatively. "That is very kind of you, but your professionalism throughout the evening was already more than enough." The manager insisted with quiet sincerity. "Hospitality means making sure our guests leave with a better memory than the one they expected." Vanessa thanked him warmly, and within minutes the freshly prepared meals were placed before the sisters. The dining room slowly returned to its familiar Friday evening rhythm. Conversations resumed naturally. Laughter gradually replaced silence. Servers moved comfortably between tables once again. Outside the windows, the lights of downtown Atlanta reflected across the sidewalks as traffic continued flowing through the city, completely unaware that an important lesson had quietly unfolded inside a neighborhood restaurant. Ethan and Kyle respectfully wished everyone a good evening before leaving with Sergeant Hayes. Captain Sullivan and David Morgan followed shortly afterward, each returning to the responsibilities waiting beyond the restaurant doors. The retired veteran tipped his hat politely before heading home, while the manager returned to welcoming arriving guests with the same friendly smile he had offered all evening. At last, Vanessa and Victoria looked at one another and laughed softly as they finally picked up their forks. The dinner they had planned hours earlier had grown into something neither sister could have predicted, yet neither allowed the experience to take away the peace they had come searching for. They talked about family, future vacations, and ordinary life once again, leaving work exactly where it belonged. When they finally stepped outside beneath the warm Atlanta night sky, they walked side by side without looking back. Their badges had never been the most important part of the story. The quiet strength with which they carried themselves had been. Because authority may earn attention, but dignity earns lasting respect, and the strongest form of justice will always begin with the courage to replace assumptions with truth.